Hello and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a change maker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Sea level rise due to melting glaciers on Greenland and in the Arctic and Antarctic could force the relocation of 267 million people and entire cities located less than 2 meters, that's 6.5 feet, from today's waterline by the year 2100. NASA warns that continued warming could raise sea levels by 5 meters, that's 16 feet, by 2300. The early damage will be felt across more than twice the expected coastal land than previously expected, according to a January 2023 Dutch research study published in the journal Earth's Future, because, they said, satellite analyses had misestimated the altitude of heavily forested land. So there's a lot more low-lying land out there than we thought. The potential cost of protecting seaside cities and raising port facilities will run into the trillions of dollars. Perhaps that spending can be an opportunity to rethink our infrastructure comprehensively, but in the midst of a crisis, people are not prone to be very forward-looking, are they? Oceanographer John Englander has raised the alarm about sea level rise in his books High Tide on Main Street and Moving to Higher Ground. And for more than a decade, he's been talking about this issue. We last spoke with him in 2021 when Moving to Higher Ground was released. And he returns to the show today to update us about the pace of warming, sea level rise in general, and human preparation for adaptation to a world of constantly rising seas. John runs the Rising Seas Institute and leads regular visits to Greenland to spur awareness of the accelerating loss of glaciers. He was featured in an October 2022 New York Times story about one of those trips, in which he said, and I quote, "Sea level, like earthquakes and mudslides, is something that happens irregularly and can change rather quickly and surprise us. The point is, you can no longer predict the future by the recent past," unquote. We may not be able to predict the future, but we can certainly open our eyes to the potential futures that we face. John's the witness to whom we need to listen, and I'm pleased to have him back on Sustainability in Your Ear. You can learn more about John and his work at johnenglander.net. That's John Englander, no space, no dash, johnenglander.net. Welcome back to the show, John. It's great to have you.
Same here, Mitch.
Well, hey, I don't want to be the bad news guy, but let's start at the darkest depths of the story. How fast are sea level rise? How fast are sea levels rising? And is there hope of heading off flooding of coastal regions before the 21st century or the 22nd century?
Okay. So the global average rate of sea level rise at the moment is about 5 millimeters a year. That's just a little less than a quarter of an inch. Mm-hmm. That's, who cares? A quarter of an inch of water height in the oceans, it's irrelevant. But like the pandemic, what needs to get our attention is the unpredictability for the future, the rate of acceleration, and how abruptly it can change based upon what we know. Those are the questions which should bother us, not the absolute height of sea level or the change. And at a quarter of an inch a year, again, who cares compared to storms, wave, extreme high tides, coastal erosion, all the other things. The problem is, we know from geologic history that sea level goes up and down 120 meters. That's about 400 feet. And it can easily go more than a foot a decade. Mm-hmm. And so like the pandemic warnings years ago, before we had the COVID outbreak and everybody saw what exponential growth can do, okay, that's what should get our attention. And the unpredictability of the collapse of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, which we'll come back to in a second, the unpredictability of that is the problem. Because if we can't know when we'll have 5 feet of sea level rise, our temptation is to wait till we know to adapt. And we can't, or we shouldn't.
Well, that's the key, is that how do we plan or prepare for this in a way that we can get the political support to do? Do you see, for instance, the UN's recent report about the underestimation of sea level rise as a potential catalyst for that kind of conversation?
I think it helps, but again, unfortunately, we human beings, we are very reluctant to be inconvenienced or do something unappetizing, unappealing now, unless it's imminent and absolutely 100% certain with clarity. And whether it be saving for retirement, whether it be, planning for pandemics as a nation, or just the unfortunate eventualities of life. What if we get cancer, or what if we get a heart attack? We deal with those things when they're in front of us, because
I'm reminded of the conversation about wearing a mask.
Right. That's right. And all the reports were there about the pandemic was imminent, could happen, and we should prepare. Bill Gates wrote a thing, the Pentagon wrote a thing, the White House. Okay, we didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is even harder, because the risk of a pandemic we knew was tens of million people getting sick or dying. But sea level rising 5 or 10 feet, and if we don't know when it'll happen, and even if we knew when it would happen, the truth is we would be reluctant to adapt. Mm-hmm. Because here's the kicker, for 6,000 years, all of human civilization, effectively 6, 8, 10, whatever you want to call civilization, sea level hasn't changed much.
No.
And we've believed that sea level was a benchmark. We measure property above sea level or something below sea level, right? We've always had this benchmark or datum, a reference point of sea level, which determines the coastline, okay, all over the world. And in modern civilization, again, 6,000 years, relatively modern, that's ancient to some people, but in geologic history, that's really modern. Sea level's been stable.
Well, that was one of the most important ideas that I came away from your book, Moving to Higher Ground, with, is that this benchmark, this hard fact that we always have thought about is variable. And you can see it in terms of very ancient human history, prehistory. There are caves along coastlines that are now underwater in which people clearly live, but they're 30 feet underwater.
Absolutely. No, it's probably the hardest concept for us to consider. I mean, life and death, we know that there can be tragedies and accidents and volcanoes and pandemics and earthquakes, as just happened this week, and tens of thousands of people dying. Volcanoes blowing their stacks and putting out ash clouds and possibility of nuclear bombs. We've seen them happen in the recent century. We accept all that because we've seen it. The last time sea level was higher was 122,000 years ago, when, as you'll recall, and I think we've discussed this last time, but the last time sea level was higher at the warm spot in the last ice age cycle, it was 25 feet higher than now, 7 meters. That's hard for us. We can't comprehend that.
Well, if that were to happen, let's just say 5 feet by 2100. How many people would be displaced? And can you kind of paint a picture of what coastal communities would be lost?
Sure. The estimate is somewhere like 500 million people, maybe a billion, would be displaced. And the reason it's such a vague number is when you think about it, think about flooding at the coast, whether it be in your nearby big city, Seattle, whether it's Boston, whether it's Miami, whether it's New Orleans or Charlotte or Mobile, Alabama, or internationally, Jakarta, Tokyo, or Mumbai. I mean, we can just go around the world, okay? And that's the issue, is that there's 140 nations that border the ocean. And whether it be 1,000 coastal cities in the United States, or a place in Indonesia, which has even more, okay, or someplace like Germany, which has a fairly narrow footprint on the ocean or coastal, area. Each situation is different. But again, the thing that makes sea level rise pernicious and difficult is that even in the worst case scenario of Antarctic's Thwaites Glacier or Pine Island glaciers accelerating collapse, which is happening, and sliding into the sea, and the same thing happened with the big one in Greenland, the Jakobshavn or Kangia Glacier at Ilulissat. Even in a catastrophic scenario, we might be talking a foot or two a decade. Okay, I mean, maybe a foot in 3 years, but it's not like our minds are prepared for the tsunami, okay, which can come in and kill 200,000 people during the night, as we've seen, okay, by washing over an island in Indonesia, as happened. not too many years ago, or Fukushima, where it damaged the nuclear power plant, or a terrible coastal storm. We just had one in Florida a few months ago, Hurricane Ian, which wiped out a couple of communities on the west coast of Florida. Those are sudden flooding. Our brain can get our heads around that because we've seen it.
Sure.
And it can happen really quickly without warning. Okay. We will accept that as a potential risk. Okay. And for those two reasons, we've seen it. And when it happens really fast. Okay. Even in the worst scenario for sea level rise. Okay. We're talking more on the order of a foot or two a decade. Okay, I'll give you a foot or two a year, but it's not the same flight or flight risk that we're used to dealing with in other risks.
So you've been on the ground regularly in Greenland. Tell
Yes.
us about what's going on there, because the reports from last year, when it was raining at a place where it had not rained in recorded history, are alarming. How fast is the ice loss accelerating? And just Greenland alone, how much sea level rise are we talking about over the next decade or two?
Yeah, great. So Greenland is the place I'm most familiar with in terms of the threat factor. I've been going there more or less every year since 2007, well, with a couple of gaps. But so I have a good span of looking at it for 15 years. And I was there last year and we'll be back this summer. The biggest single glacier, it's either known as Jakobshavn, the Danish name, or Kangia, the Inuit name, and often now known by Ilulissat, the town where it goes into the ocean, the fjord enters. By itself, it holds 1.5 feet of sea level rise. It's
just one glacier.
One glacier. Yeah. Now it's big enough. It's about the size of not quite Florida, but it's a big glacier. Okay, a couple hundred miles long.
Just Florida. Okay.
Yes. So, and it's a mile or two tall. Okay. But it's embedded in a bigger ice sheet. So you don't see it visually like you see a glacier in the Alps or Glacier National Park or even in Alaska that people tend to have a very distinct. In Antarctica and Greenland, being the two places covered by miles of ice, the glaciers are much more subtle in some ways because it's this white river of ice in a white, larger ice sheet. Okay. And so, and they're moving at, a couple of miles a year type thing, but the speed is increasing. The speed has doubled or tripled now, or even quadrupled in some of the glaciers. So again, very hard to visualize, but we can see it because if you have historical context and you know where to look, you can see where the glacier was 15 years ago, because the walls of the fjords have been scraped clean by the incredible the biggest bulldozer in the world is a glacier, and that has an effect on the mountain walls on the adjacent fjords, and now it's hundreds of feet lower. And people say, oh yeah, I remember in 2007 when it was there. And satellite measurements now, so we have a very clear picture, and it's accelerating, and it's somewhat unpredictable. But in places in Greenland on that glacier, the speed is now triple what it was 30 years ago. Now,
and ultimately, the way it raises the sea level, it doesn't necessarily have to melt and run into the ocean. Large chunks of ice, like in a cup of water, will raise the sea level as they break off. The other really major concern is thwaites, both the ice shelf and the glacier. There was a study released in Nature just the week that we're talking, this will be published a week later, that described it in kind of amorphous terms, but they said, and I quote, "It's still moving as quickly as it ever has been." But they identified that there were a lot more cracks underneath the ice shelf, which imply that those big chunks of ice are going to break off faster. How does that glacier impact sea level rise?
Well, all of Greenland's ice, if it melted, would cause 24 feet of sea level rise globally. A little over 7 meters. Antarctica is 7 times that, okay? 56 meters or 185 feet, okay, of sea level rise, if it all melted. That's not gonna happen for centuries, okay? I mean, probably millennia. But based upon what we see happening now, and even the recent articles like that, and the cameras which are now underneath the glacier, where it comes out into the ocean and the ice shelf, the floating ice shelf, where it breaks off into icebergs, which, as you say, were floating, so don't directly affect sea level. They already had that ice had its effect on sea level when it came out onto the ocean as a floating ice shelf, or breaks off as a new iceberg entering the sea, just as you said. That's when it has the effect on sea level rise. We are seeing more and more signs of cracking, fissures, breakaway ice shelves, fragmenting gigantic glaciers, both in Greenland, more visibly, Antarctica, bigger, slower, but changing quickly, and hard to quantify. And people are, the non-scientist, I guess, or the skeptic says, well, that just means scientists don't know what they're doing. Well, for the same reason, we can't predict the earthquake that just killed, 30 or 40,000 people a week ago. We don't know when the next San Francisco earthquake will be. We don't know when Yellowstone will blow. Earth's plates and the ice sheets are very much like the Earth's plates. I mean, they look sort of solid, but they're like modeling clay. They'll deform under force. And again, sea level's been stable for 6,000 years, quite literally. So we have no human conditioning, cultural, except if you want to think back to the biblical flood or some of the other tales in the Pacific Northwest that the Haida tell up in your region of the world, where they talk about the sea rising quickly and having to move to the next higher island and things like that 11,000 years ago, which is when sea level was rising at the rate of 15 feet a century. Okay, we know that from the geologic record. But unless we've studied geology and glaciology, we don't know those things, right? And so we're, yes.
Or if you're Salish, you know the history of your people. And so one of the most important things I think you've done in the last couple of years is convert a climate skeptic at the New York Times. You took him to Greenland, and it was Brett Stevens. What's your assessment of the way that we're telling the story in the press in particular? Is the story, and Jacques Cousteau gave you this advice, it needs to be simple, visual, and emotionally engaging. Are we doing that?
We're doing better, I think. And I've certainly, tried whatever I can do to help. And people like you who get the message out further are really the next layer. And Brett Stevens, as you said, and we should perhaps talk about that. But so I think we're making progress. But given what's at risk, back to your question a few minutes ago, very relevant. When you look at the world, not just the United States, not just the Northwest, Seattle, Vancouver area, but the entire coastline of the world, 140 nations, and realize that we're heavily built up on the coast for not just shipping and fisheries and recreation and water power, the old water mills, mill towns and stuff like that, where rivers enter the sea. From the Mississippi to the Nile, to the Amazon. I mean, the huge river systems that come out at the sea in the delta areas. We, for good reason, assume that sea level is stable and the shoreline is stable. It was only in the last century or so we came to understand the Ice Age history well enough to realize the numbers which I've given, which is that sea level goes up and down naturally, this 100 meters, several hundred feet, every 100,000 years, roughly. It's been doing it for 2.5 million years. That was by nature. But now we've changed things because we're changing the atmosphere and trapping heat and warming the planet to extraordinary levels, and now melting the ice sheets outside of the normal ice age cycles, as we've discussed. It's really hard for us to get our head around that or know the number and how to prepare for it, because one, we've never seen it. Yeah. And the fact is, for all those good, obvious reasons, sea level is fairly stable, the shoreline's fairly stable. We should build right up to it. And now we're being told, even by someone like me, well, this century we could have 4 or 5 feet on the low end and maybe 10 or 15 feet on the high end for sea level in the next 100 years. How do you plan for that? Okay. And the truth is, even if you accepted it, you don't want to plan for it. And the resistance to try and plan for something which really won't be a problem in our lifetime, but is going to be a real problem in our children's lifetimes. Okay. That's a real tough one.
It is. So I have a concrete example of this in my life. My daughter is considering, well, not considering, she is moving to the Netherlands. And I've been to the town she's going to be living in. There's a meter stick and they're 16 meters below sea level.
Wow.
Could I be talking her out of that? If in fact you can even talk a daughter out of doing anything?
Well, the Netherlands is a great example, of course. You know, for 1,000 years, long before electricity or modern society, they've been reclaiming land from the sea in the Delta area there where the three rivers come together, and like a third of the country is underwater, is below sea level. And they, again, pre-electricity with windmills and a simple pump, found out you could build a polder, a dike, and then pump the water out and you have more land. And that's what the country's based upon. And until the storm in 1953, when in the middle of the night, it was a serious storm and it breached the levees and 1,800 people died overnight, as well as a couple hundred in the UK and Brussels. They started re-engineering things to make sure that they had better defenses, but they only planned for 30 centimeters or a foot of sea level rise. And even they had no idea to think that we need to plan for 3 to 5 meters, 10 to 15 feet. And it's causing a challenge for them. So back to your daughter's very practical situation. Sea level rise in the next, 10 or 20 years, she's probably going to be in that house or that town. I don't expect it to be catastrophic. However, with Antarctica and Greenland, as we've been talking about, it could significantly increase, but significantly is a matter of, let's say, a half a foot. 10 centimeters in the Netherlands terms. But here's the problem. Once you put down roots, and we're all examples of it, it's harder to move as you get older, and it takes your kids moving or your parents, situation moving back home or something like that. So it's not that she's at risk in the next 5 or 10 years, in my opinion, okay? The problem is if she settles down there, that she needs to anticipate it. Now, the Netherlands, the last thing that I just point out makes them unique is because of this history, because a third of the country is below sea level, because they do good engineering. There is no private flood insurance by public policy because the government, in effect, has taken on the role of water engineering for the country. And so there is no flood insurance in the Netherlands, and they're really good at it. But even they are struggling now with the reality that they could be looking at a couple of meters of sea level rise this century has put them back to the drawing boards, and they're struggling. So the bottom line, simple answer for you and your daughter or case, I'd be aware of it. I'd be aware that there could be future flooding. And the risk of things in today's world, it's probably not the worst risk. But yeah, you have to assume that just because it's been well engineered since the storm of 1953, when 1,800 people died that night, even the Dutch are scratching their heads about what is safe civil engineering, design heights for the world ahead in this era when sea level will rise in a way that it has not for all of human history.
Well, and that's the other interesting thing about the Dutch is everybody has an axe in their attic, so they can chop their way out as the water rises. And, I have pointed that out. This is really a practical conversation and kind of emotionally charged for me, but we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. We're back to continue talking with John Englander. He is the author of several books about sea level rise, including High Tide on Main Street and Moving to Higher Ground. John, I'm a little emotional after the last part of our conversation, but what I wanted to ask is, are you seeing any encouraging signs that humanity is beginning to understand what we have done in changing its habits enough to head off the worst of this?
Yes and no. I see more and more people and articles in the media, but just in all sorts of venues where people accept that sea level is rising, and more people accept that this probably does result from the greenhouse gases warming the planet, as people predicted 30 or 40 years ago, manifest in these strange weather patterns and extreme storms and droughts and wildfires and all these other things. But sea level, there's probably a connection with the melting ice. People are getting that. But again, as we said earlier, the fact that it's not a sudden event like a tsunami or even a storm or coastal flooding takes away the urgency.
Mhm.
It's like planning for retirement or planning what if I happens if I get cancer. You don't worry about that till you or a family member has it, right? And then it's so disruptive to think that sea level is going to be 5 or 10 feet higher at some point. We just can't predict when. So I think there's this growing awareness, but we still have a reluctance to move inland or build a world that is safe at 10 feet of sea level rise while we're trying to slow the warming to maybe have it tap out at 10 feet, let's say, over the next 100 years. And then the indefinite aspect of it. Even somebody gets to me, asks me to consult on a project, and they say, what's the safe number? Is it 5 feet? Is it 8 feet? Is it 10 feet? Is it 12 feet? Is it 20 feet? It depends on how safe you want to be, like building a nuclear power plant, or is very different than building a town or a new
and it depends on your timeline.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are building a nuclear plant that you want to operate for 200 years, if that's even possible, you definitely want to be prepared for the kind of sea level rise you're talking about. That's a very challenging decision for somebody who has to finance these things. And of course, whether it's society, government, or private, that question that they ask you as a consultant is got to be the hardest one to answer.
It is. And of course, you want to be very honest. But I always use metaphors, which scientists rarely do, because they help us to put something in other terms. We know that Yellowstone's going to blow. We know that San Francisco is going to have another earthquake similar to a century ago. Okay. We're sort of taking that into account in our building codes, but not really. Okay. I mean, yes, there's an effort, but we accept some things like that as being rather unpredictable. The problem with sea level is it doesn't have the rapidity. If Thwaites continues to fracture and has these huge breaks under the ice sheet, as is happening in Antarctica, or this acceleration in Greenland, even with that, we're talking maybe a few feet in a decade. And so how do you design for that? And yet the problem is that it's the sea level base height, and then at a high tide, sometimes called king tides, particularly in your area, and it's more of a global term now, the perigean high tides, when the planets line up. And then if we get heavy rainfall and runoff, and so flooding coming downhill, or just like in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. So if we get flooding from different sources, but sea levels like the drip filling the bucket, and we tend to ignore it. But you can put a bucket out overnight, and if the drip's getting faster and faster because the leak in the roof, the question is, by morning, will the bucket be overflowing? And you don't know that either. But you can realize the problem, so you probably put a bigger bucket out or something. I'm being silly, but the problem with sea levels, we don't know.
Well, for me, for instance, the Port of Los Angeles, which of course we all paid attention to during the pandemic because of the backup in the supply chain, is an example of a place that it's only going to take about 1.5 feet to inundate. Do you see us thinking in terms that will allow a threshold like that to change our thinking about our public policy, or the cost of doing business in a way that will transform our response to sea level rise?
To some degree. The problem is when we pick out something like the Port of Los Angeles, which is a great example, since I think it's our busiest port, and or the Houston Ship Channel in terms of the petroleum products and tankers that go up in and out there, as well as freighters. There's a lot of vulnerable cities that New Orleans, of course, but Miami, and again, there's hundreds of them. Okay. And no one, in terms of sea level rise, no one of them is unique or indicative. In other words, while the water is getting higher in Los Angeles, it's happening in Seattle, and you've got a fragile seawall not too far from where you are. Vancouver's worried. Should they be designing for 1 meter or 2 meters? Okay. They're trying to be, futuristic. And then the flooding problem, like Hurricane Sandy, which we remember from a decade ago, or Hurricane Harvey or Irma, these different major storms, they pile the water ever higher. And if they hit at a high tide, and if it happens to be a full moon high tide or king tide, that's what's causing the flooding. The extra couple inches from sea level rise kind of gets lost in the wash. The problem is that sea level is the baseline, okay, the benchmark. And so we never really look at the sea level problem when there's a disaster, because there's always something that's happened at, greater magnitude and imminence, right? The immediacy. And so, and then there's sea level rise, but we're still only talking quarters, fractions of an inch. And yet, when we look at the history, as I said at the start of this great chat, we know three things: that at a global level, as the planet's average temperature changes, and that happened both by natural forces of the ice age cycles, by the elliptical orbit around the sun, but now because of trapping heat in the atmosphere, and that's all quantified, and there's really no dispute about it. We know that for each degree Celsius, that's about roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that global sea level changes about 20 meters, about 45 feet, 60 feet. It's a question of how quickly you can melt the ice. But we do know that sea level goes up and down 400 feet, 120 meters, which is over 9 degrees Fahrenheit and 5 degrees Celsius. There, I got it straight. And if you divide that out, it works out to about 20 feet per degree, okay, Fahrenheit even. And that's in the pipeline. It's just a matter of the ice melting and an adjustment happening. So we know that number. We know where this is headed when we get to new equilibrium, which may not be for 200 years. The second thing is, again, we know historically how much it goes up and down 120 meters. That should get our attention. And the third thing is, we know clearly from geologic history, even without human influence and warming, that the rate of change can be as much as a foot a decade. And that 11,000 years ago, that went on for 400 years. And for 400 years, sea level was rising on average more than a foot a decade, nonstop. Okay, it's hard for us to get our heads around.
The oceans are the Earth's heat sink.
Right.
And so we have, as you said, we've built in this future sea level rise. What's your assessment as an oceanographer of the potential to use ocean-based approaches to carbon capture to start to cool the environment and ultimately cool the oceans, which will follow the lower atmospheric temperature? Are there good options that would be good for the environment in addition to just solving the problem of a warm atmosphere? Ocean planting kelp forests, or using ocean iron fertilization, for instance. Can we use the oceans in a non-destructive way to solve this problem?
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad you covered, I think, in effect, two aspects. One is to think of it as a heat sink. And so we're storing heat. We've warmed the oceans. We've put the excess heat that we're trapping in the atmosphere. 93% of it gets stored in the ocean. So we are seeing a very slight but really significant increase in the heat stored in the ocean, like a thermal battery, or like a hot rock, if you will, or an outdoor swimming pool, as I use the metaphor, when you go from colder climes to or seasons to warm, and then vice versa. The heat capacity of the swimming pool even, okay, has a lag time. Well, that's what's happening now, is we're warming the world and the oceans are warming, but there's so much heat capacity in the ocean that it's hard to notice it unless you're measuring it very precisely. So that's the oceans and atmosphere will try and reach equilibrium, but that takes a while, decades or centuries for full equilibrium. The second part that you just referred to is, can we use the oceans and their capacity, not just in terms of the heat energy, but as a force to help us go through these transitions, is really important, because the oceans at 72%, we think of the surface area, but 98% of the biosphere, if you think about the height of the tree canopy to the root systems on land and the depth of the oceans, there's more biomass in the oceans than there is in all the forests of the world. and ironically, from kelp to phytoplankton, again, more than any other carbon sink we can imagine. And so there have been concepts and even experiments. Can we, for using iron dust, as you talked about, ocean iron fertilization is one example. It's a little controversial, but I tend to think it has a lot of promise. There's nervousness about us throwing off the ocean ecosystem, which fair enough, and very valid to be concerned. But if you look at the numbers, the ocean are one of the few places where you can sequester enough what we call carbon, but really carbon dioxide, getting it out of the atmosphere and turning it into organic material, like whether it be kelp or whether it be trees in the Amazon. Those carbon sinks, those things that are helping to take carbon out of the atmosphere and slow the cooling or reverse the cooling, are very valid and really are worthy of study, and are one of the few places where we could change the dynamics, in our favor, but needs to be done with great caution, because if we muck it up, make it worse, we have.
There goes some of our food supply too.
Right.
Are there any of those strategies that you've heard that you think we just shouldn't even try because of the potential harm to the ocean?
Because of where we're headed, in my view, in terms of, not only the temperature, but the melting ice and the rising sea level and what that's going to do to the world, the risk of where we're headed is so bad that I hate to say it, but I think everything has to be on the table, because this is not a matter of what we'd like anymore. We were warned about this 50 years ago. We were warned about this 100 years ago, burning fossil fuels. We are way past the point of where we can choose, the things which are less distasteful or less dangerous or unappealing. Okay, we really have to start looking at all of this. There are two thoughts a few minutes ago that you triggered that I want to come back to.
Sure.
One was the story which made the New York Times. Actually was a big feature, as you know, several months ago by Bret Stephens. And he was not just a climate skeptic, that's probably an accurate term. He thought the climate community was overreacting and overstating the situation. Yeah. He accepted the climate change was a problem and we were probably a cause of it. But he thought the climate community was way overstating it. And I got him to come to Greenland and last September on one of these fact-finding expeditions, which I tend to do. And it blew his mind. I mean, for 3 days there, every day he told me, John, thank you for getting me here. I had no idea. And he's a really smart guy, like photographic memory, and he's an amazing source of information about so many things, but it really opened his eyes. And he wrote that. He told that story. In fact, he told how I got him there and the revelation. And now he saw the power of this and why I'm so concerned. And he accepted it. The only place he differed from what he thinks my position is that he thinks instead of relying on government to figure this out, that we should look for free market mechanisms to deal with some of this. And I tend to be a free market person. I think libertarian is a great political concept in theory. So I didn't have a problem with that. I just, I think assuming the free market can handle this is also, misplaced.
Well, as you said, everything should be on the table. The idea that we should exclude government is probably as wrongheaded as the idea that we should be totally reliant on the free market.
Right. And then, you said something else in terms of what should we be doing in terms of educating people or getting, I don't think you said politicians or government, but, and here's, I guess, where I have a surprising view is, for particularly my second book, Moving to Higher Ground, probably the most surprising takeaway from the book is, instead of thinking that the action item is to get government to do something, which again, there's some truth as we were just covering, and each of us planning for us or our kids where they should live and how close to the water's, edge do we build? What can each of us do? I mean, whether it be bicycling to work like they do in the Netherlands, or whether or up in all over the world more and more, or switching to solar power and things like that, or electric cars and big batteries and so on. And that's all good stuff. But when I really spent a long time, years, thinking about this, what can the average person do? What the average person can do, that's the easiest thing in the world, is to educate other people.
Yeah.
Because very few people know these facts, as we have just laid this out, even in this half hour here, Mitch. And if you think about it, instead of getting Congress to do something, instead of getting your community to change the building codes because of something that may not happen for 30 or 40 years, the easiest thing to do, and sea level becomes a vehicle, because the couple of numbers that I've laid out here more than once now, are so powerful that just getting anyone, and whether it's a 16-year-old, a 6-year-old, or a 60-year-old, to understand the facts about the sea level went up and down hundreds of feet, what's happening now, the rate's changing, it's not stoppable, we need to start building higher. That creates a reality for the climate change, for the greenhouse gases, for the carbon capture sequestration, for the switching to solar panels. All of those things hinge off the case from rising sea level naturally by the ice ages, and now because we're warming the atmosphere. That really simple science case that I do with these easy metaphors. Whether somebody uses my books, and I even tell them in the book how to get a set of slides that they can use for free, find your own language. But the truth is, educating people, just like I did with Brett Stevens, who was very unabashed that it worked on him. There is no person that I've ever met who's immune to clear understanding, oh, the world is different than I thought it was. We need to, if we care about our kids or our legacy or even our investment in our homes and our communities, we should start thinking about this. And things change when the public wants it to change, whether that be political policy, whether it be abortion rights, whether it be, gun rights, or the
shape of markets and what we're offered for sale. Right.
So the simplest thing that the average person can do, sure, look at your house and your vulnerability to flooding and all that in your family. Maybe advocate for it if you're an architect or engineer, particularly, and try and put it into practice. But the biggest thing is just educate people about the basics here. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not trying to sell books, but you've been very kind to, compliment that my easy language, non-technical jargon way to explain it. But whether somebody uses my book or several of the other good books that turn the science into stories and simple examples, that's what any person listening to this podcast can do, and say they will teach 3 people, and hopefully each of those people will teach 3 people, or whatever the multiplier is. That's the simplest thing to get change.
That was going to be my last question. So you anticipated it perfectly. Thank you. What's next for you, and how can folks follow along?
Great. I've fallen down on my blog post, but I am going to try and get back to that. So that's one thing, johnenglander.net. But I do these groups to Greenland. They're a very high-end program, but people can find my website, johnenglander.net, or this nonprofit, the Rising Seas Institute. Mm-hmm. And there's places there to find out about this trip to Greenland, although I expect very few people to do that. I've got to decide whether there's another book in me. I've done 2, as you noted, and that's a big decision to make, probably in the next 12 months. And then do more of this. I mean, people like you, each, you have your various audiences, and it's really important to have people like you carry the message further. And I plan to do that for, quite a number of years yet.
Well, we look forward to helping you amplify that story in the future. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Mitch. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for your good work.
We've been talking with John Englander. He's an oceanographer and author of High Tide on Main Street, as well as Moving to Higher Ground. He also leads several trips a year to Greenland, where he introduces his guests to the geology, glaciology, and science of sea level rise on the very glaciers that are at risk. So check that out. You can learn more about John and his work at johnenglander.net. John Englander is all one word, no space, no dash, johnenglander.net. Today's 5 millimeter of sea level rise for each year is a signal that is easy to ignore, as John said. The unpredictability of glacial changes, the name glacial changes, suggests something slow that now happens 3 to 5 times faster than just 50 years ago. That unpredictability has enabled society to mostly ignore the dire warnings that nature is sending. Some may still say this is all natural, but they're ignoring how humans have accelerated the process by orders of magnitude compared to the long cycles that John described. His advice is dead on. Learn for yourself, whether about sea level rise in general or how it will affect your community in particular, and then share that story with your family and your neighbors. Tell your city council, call your Congress critters, and get the conversation started about, 1, ending the burning of fossil fuels that is the primary forcing factor in global warming. 2, exploring resilience strategies to make your community ready for today's unpredictable impacts, from extreme weather to flooding to potentially fast sea level rise. And 3, and finally, how society can prepare and adapt over the long run to rising seas and the disruptions to life, supply chains, and the natural world that it will bring. We can all take these steps. There's nothing stopping us from learning and exercising our judgment to share these stories. I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this show and any of the more than 380 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear that we've produced already. Get this out there. Take a minute or two to write a review. You can help others find us. You are the amplifiers that spread the ideas that lead to a less wasteful and more sustainable world. Let folks know they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. We will appreciate your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.